Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, lead me near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call. Hold my hand, lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the darkness appears and the night draweth near, and the day is past and gone, at the river I stand. Guide my feet, hold my hand. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
The gap is growing. I'm talking about the gap between the richest and the poorest people and the richest and the poorest nations. Regarding this disparity between individuals in the United States, it has become a major issue in the presidential campaigns. But the distance between those enjoying wealth and those enduring poverty is even greater when considered from a global perspective. I'm not going to bog you down with statistics, but I would like to share some which should open your eyes. And let me point out that since these facts are not completely current, the situation is even worse than they indicate. Bernie Sanders has pointed out over and over that in the United States, the top 1% of the population controls 80% of the wealth. Whether or not you like Bernie Sanders, his figures are correct. But let's go beyond our borders and see what's happening around the globe. Socially and economically, 17% of the world's population controls 80% of the world's resources. which means that about 83% have to live on what's left. As a result, billions of people try to exist without the basic necessities of life: food, water, housing, sanitation. Specifically, 1.2 billion people live on less than $1 per day, while another 3 billion live on less than $2 per day. 800 million go to bed hungry every night, and 30,000 to 60,000 die of hunger on a daily basis. On the flip side, the world's 500 or so billionaires have assets of over $2 trillion, a sum greater than the income of the poorest 170 nations on the planet. 20% of the people in developed nations consume 86% of the world's goods, and 12% of the world's population uses 85% of its water. I mentioned that the gap between the richest and the poorest countries is growing. Well, in 1820, the disparity was 5-1, which in the course of time has grown to 72-1 in 1992. Imagine what it is today. Just a few more facts, and I'm going to move on. The annual revenue of some companies is greater than, for example, the income of Nigeria, with its 120 million citizens, a nation the size of Europe. Every day, 34,000 children under the age of 5 die of hunger and or its related diseases. That's over 6 million children a year. 1.2 billion people lack access to clean water. 2.4 billion people live without decent sanitation. 4 billion people have virtually no wastewater disposal. And energy? The United States, with 5% of the world's population, uses 25% of its coal, 26% of its oil, 27% of the gas. Yet with all that, our very wealthiest citizens keep wanting and getting more and more, while we as a nation believe we are entitled to as much as we want, and we will do just about anything to get it. All this while pretending that we are self-sufficient and have gotten to where we are because we have pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps as a result of our exceptionalism. Really? And yet before we go to work in the morning, we have already depended upon half the world to supply the necessary elements of the lifestyles that we enjoy. We are here this morning because we claim allegiance to Jesus. How do we think Jesus would react to those figures and statistics that I have just shared with you? I don't think we have to imagine a whole lot. He was pretty blunt during his entire ministry regarding such issues. In some way, Jesus was a realist and recognized that the world was the way that it was. Did he want to change it? To be sure. But he wasn't intent upon destroying all inequalities. He wasn't on a crusade to make everyone the same. He did not have anything against wealth in and of itself, although he did maintain that the rich might have a tougher time securing a place in the kingdom of God, depending upon how they got and how they used their wealth. What he did want to do was secure justice for everyone, and especially to make sure that everyone had enough, particularly food. Maybe that's why there are so many New Testament stories and examples about eating, banqueting, feasting, partying. And in that vein, we find a lot of references to bread and to fish. This didn't start with Jesus. As we saw in our reading from Exodus, after crossing the Red Sea on their escape from Egypt, the Hebrews faced some daunting difficulties. After all, they had been slaves and they were not really prepared to fare for themselves in the wilderness. Among other things, they got hungry, and God provided. In addition to quail, each morning they discovered on the ground a flaky substance which Moses said was manna, a kind of divinely sent bread. What's interesting here, I think, is that the text points out very plainly that there was enough for everyone, but that it could not be stored or hoarded. Among other things, that meant that nobody could corner the market. The manna was there for the taking, and everyone could get his or her fill, but only for that day. And the next day, all would start over again from the same place and under the same conditions. One of the most familiar events in the life of Jesus was the feeding of the 5,000. You remember that one? Jesus was out in the country, and suddenly people came from all over to hear what he had to say. Jesus being Jesus, he taught them for hours, and then it was evening. The disciples came to him and told him that it was supper time, and the folks were hungry. Jesus said, "Well, feed them." The disciples said they did not have enough food for so many. Jesus asked them how much did they have. They replied, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus blessed the elements and broke the bread and divided the fish, and not only did everyone get fed, but there were 12 baskets of leftovers. Without getting into a discussion regarding the story's miraculous considerations, let me point out that once again, everybody got enough. The Bible speaks over and over about bread, even in the Lord's Prayer. And sometimes we forget how important fish was for the people of that place in that time. Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, with Rome's permission, established the city of Tiberias on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He did it to brown-nose the Roman emperor, but at the same time, he had economic motivations as well. There was a lot of fishing in and around the city when it was still a small village. By establishing his capital there, Herod could take over the fishing industry, a very profitable venture. Of course, it meant that those doing the fishing could keep less and less of the take, and at times had trouble even feeding their families. Here was another action questioned by Jesus, who was concerned with justice. And there was nothing just about the rich and powerful Herod controlling the fish market at the expense of the people. This brings us to today's service of communion. And believe it or not, the Last Supper also serves as an example of Jesus' quest for justice and the price that must sometimes be paid to secure it. What happened in that upper room in Jerusalem at that Passover meal? Jesus, as the host, took two of the elements, the bread and the wine, and gave them to his friends. Thus, symbolically, the one gave to the many. And they all got an equal share. Nobody got more, nobody got less. Peter, as the unofficial leader of the disciples, didn't get a bigger portion. They were all equal. And in comparing the bread and the wine to his body and his blood, Jesus was telling them that fighting for justice was not always easy or safe, which he subsequently proved with his crucifixion. We all want to lead the good life, but at whose expense? When is enough enough? And when is too much too much? Can we justify the existence of billionaires when so many of the world's people are starving to death, especially when some of those billionaires don't do anything for those less fortunate, which would be just about everybody? How many houses does one need? How many boats does one need? How many cars does one need? How many toys does one need to be happy? And how should such questions be answered by those who claim to follow the Jesus who gave his life in the cause of justice and compassion? There will never be complete social and economic equality, and I'm not sure that there should be. But there also should not be starving and dying people because some have too much and some have too little. Frankly, I get amused and angry, mostly angry, when multimillionaire political figures claim to speak for the average man and woman, many of whom can barely keep their heads above water and put food on the table and a roof over their heads. I get amused and angry, mostly angry, when money manipulators who produce nothing tangible make billions of dollars by shuffling funds around, while people who work and work hard live from paycheck to paycheck. I get amused and angry, mostly angry, when those who have it all think greed is a good thing and don't care at all about the folks on the bottom from whom they ultimately took what they have in the first place. It was Marie Antoinette, the French queen during the French Revolution, who in her compassionless stupidity and self-designated entitlement is reported to have said, when told that the people did not have enough bread, "Let them eat cake." Justice, like the justice Jesus called for. How can we make it happen?